I do want to, first of all, express my extraordinary gratitude to Leon Kass for doing this event with us. And I just want to say very briefly, Dave, a few words about this. So Seth Sanders, who is a fascinating Semitic scholar, a secular Jew, writes in his recent work that modernity muted the Hebrew Bible Old Testament. What Leon Kass has done for us is to unmute the Hebrew Bible Old Testament, and in the process has allowed us to see how absolutely correct Seth Sanders is. In my opinion, Leon Kass's commentary work is almost unique, which I think is a scandal. We are well into what has been called the Renaissance of theological interpretation, and we have yet to see, despite myriad commentaries emerging, anything approximating the caliber of Kass's work, which opens the public dimensions of the Hebrew Bible Old Testament. And Drew, I want to thank you for apologizing to Leon, but I also want to say to Leon, I'm quite glad that your work hasn't received this kind of attention, because we want to give it this kind of attention. So Leon, I will be in touch with you about circling back and doing an event like this on Genesis. And then we're really excited about Ruth. And we also want to know what else is in the pipeline so that we can get ready. Okay, now, for some crazy reason, I got assigned the Tabernacle, which is only 176 pages apart from notes of Leon's commentary, and I've got to deal with it in under 15 minutes. So here goes. The title of my talk is The Eternal Life of the Tabernacle, the Lord's Dwelling Amidst His People. A nation requires a common narrative, and this the Exodus provides. A nation also requires law, and this Sinai provides. But is there more? The Tabernacle answers yes, there is. And intriguingly, Kass notes, and I quote, that on my most recent readings, the Tabernacle has been for me a new source of insight and reverent awe. And it's thus a great privilege for me to focus on this area of his commentary. Now, first of all, where I differ a bit with Kass, and this of course requires extensive discussion, so I'm just going to note the difference. It is unusual to take Exodus 24 with the following chapters concluding in 40, but I think this relates to Kass's confessedly unusual reading of Exodus 24. Kass argues that the ratification of the covenant through the bloody ritual is Moses's and not God's idea, and he argues that the theophany in which Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel see God and share a meal is really, if I have it right, a sort of wish-fulfilling projection. Suffice it at this point to note that I'm not convinced. Joshua Berman, for example, writes of the theophany that, and I would align myself with this kind of view, having accepted entry into the Berit, the elders of Israel ate and drank, in part presumably from the korbanot they had offered, with God symbolically receiving the meat offered on the altar, and with the elders partaking of the meat as well, a veritable feast was held in which both God and Israel participated in observance of the newly established covenant. And so in my view, what we have in Exodus 24 is the ratification of the covenant as a legally binding relationship between the Lord and the Israelites, which yields this extraordinary vision of the Lord and feasting in his presence. This seems to me closer to the text, but I note, whichever way one goes on this, it does not, in my opinion, much affect the extraordinarily rich overarching reading of Exodus 25 to 40 that Kass provides. Now, through his reading of Exodus 24, what he does foreground, which I find very interesting, are the elements in Israel's life that will need to be channeled correctly or constrained, namely creativity, which can descend into debauchery, and an appreciation of sensory beauty and seeing, which can and does descend into idolatry in Exodus 34. It also keeps Kass, which I found very interesting and I don't have time to pursue, attentive to possible ambiguity in the cultus. Although Kass repeatedly asserts that he is only reading forward, which our reading group has often discussed whether that's possible, this is intriguingly one of those places where he also reads backwards, encouraging one to read the account of the tabernacle with a split screen, one eye on the instructions to build it, and one eye on the disastrous lapse into idolatry by building the golden calf in Exodus 34. Sensitive as he is to the political and national aspects of founding a nation, Kass recognizes that the tabernacle is a major building project, set in intertextual dialogue with God's building project of creation and the autonomous venture of the Tower of Babel. As Kass observes, the key to the tabernacle is the word dwell, shachan. In Exodus 24, verse 16, the glory of the Lord dwells on Mount Sinai. And in Exodus 25, verse 8, the Lord instructs Moses, let them make for me a sanctuary, that I may dwell in their midst. Sacred time, which Kass opens up exquisitely, and is certainly a major theme of Exodus with its emphasis on the Sabbath and festivals, is insufficient in and by itself. It needs to be accompanied by sacred place. Kass discusses the different elements of the tabernacle in detail, and his analysis is peppered with rich insights. Golden cherubim sit atop the ark, intertextually evoking the only previous mention of cherubim in the Pentateuch, when they are appointed to bar the entrance back into Eden. Kass asks, might the cherubim in this story and on the Kappareth signal the possibility of atonement and a return to living with the Lord? Could the ark and its contents be for the people the true tree of life? The answer is yes, and hence my use of eternal in my title. Eternal means not life somewhere up in the heavens, but the life of the age to come, life as God intended it to be. And this is surely the invitation of the tabernacle. In the golden cherubim, the intricate lampstand and the weavings, art is given a prominent place, but always subservient to God's words. Kass's 6 or so pages on art and the tabernacle are so rich that I scanned them this morning to send them to our arts collective. I quote him, the artists are God's prophets for the eyes. The beauty they cultivate becomes the skin of the good and the holy. Among ancient Near Eastern nations, it was assumed that the gods needed food, and this was provided by those nations in abundance. The Lord's table most beautifully has all the requisite utensils as we would expect in a house, but they remain empty. The bread of the presence placed on the table perhaps expresses gratitude for the gift of bread from the earth, while Kass suggests the menorah may represent the heavens, the 7 visible planets, which of course are not gods. Of the horns on the altar, Kass provocatively asks, has the Lord grabbed Taurus by the horns, making him a mere altar on which offerings will be made instead to him? Sun worship was central to Egyptian life, but the entire layout of the tabernacle places the Israelite with his back to the sun. So the sun, far from being a god, illuminates the tabernacle, but it is not divine. The priests, and here Kass says this evocative metaphor, are God's prime ministers. I like to think of them as God's diplomatic corps, set apart to mediate between the people and the Lord, evoked in particular by the two sets of 12 stones borne by the high priest. Kass is profound in his analysis of the formation of Moses and how Moses has to appoint them, but playing no role himself in this extraordinary culmination of the development of Israel. Now, after the golden calf incident, Moses' intercession, God's glorious revelation of himself to Moses, and the renewal of the covenant, the Israelites joyfully engage in the major building project exactly as instructed by God. Once the tabernacle is erected, the cloud descends, and the tabernacle is filled with the glory of the Lord. The Lord dwells amidst his people. Kass confesses wonder and curiosity at this expression of dwelling. I quote, "To this reader, it is a complete mystery." Kass maintains that dwelling is transient, but I am dubious about this interpretation of Shachan. Dwelling here seems to be more in line with what Heidegger has in mind with dwelling, namely settling down, being fully at home. To his credit, in my view, Kass seeks to pierce this mystery and follows the text in asserting God's real presence amidst his people. He notes that the tabernacle brings the Lord down to earth and among the everyday life of the Israelites. The tabernacle provides for, and I quote, "an intimate relationship between Israel and the Lord, evident in Israel's everyday life." Now, Kass began his study of Exodus with a view to seeking wisdom on nation building. Courtesy of the tabernacle, he has arrived at the conclusion that human beings can be complete and at home only when they acknowledge their dependence on their Creator, and even more when they come intimately to know their Creator and He them. I suggest that this is profound on so many fronts. Kass has opened up to us the immense public dimensions of Exodus and shown us how the Lord's dwelling in our midst is central to them. In the process, has made the surprising journey from politics to presence. Especially those of us who are in the Christian tradition may need to make the reverse journey from presence, with which we are very, maybe too, in the light of Exodus, comfortable, to the extraordinary public dimensions of Exodus, such as politics, law, art, clothing, culture, and nation building. A genius insight, in my opinion, of this commentary is that ultimately you cannot have the one without the other. Kass rightly sees the tabernacle, in my words, as Sinai on wheels. Its portability is of the essence. Wherever the Israelites go, the tent of meeting goes with them, open for a rendezvous with God. He also rightly sees the tabernacle as a fulfillment of creation. However, where John Levinson argues that the tabernacle is a microcosm of the macrocosm of the world, Kass argues that the tabernacle is anti-cosmos, designed to correct deficiencies in the creation. Now, this needs much more elaboration. I simply note here that I think I'm with John Levinson, alas, on this issue rather than with Kass. A conclusion, Dave, I'm nearly there. A final comment about historicity. There are points in Kass's commentary where he makes the most profound points about historicity. I think, for example, of his absolutely fascinating comments about the Song of Moses being by Moses. I think the tabernacle calls for similar comments. Homan, in his rigorous study of tense in the ancient Near East, found his view changing as he studied the evidence. He says this: "Although I began this enterprise as a skeptic, The many parallels collected to the tabernacle's form and function have convinced me that an elaborate tent served as the focal point for Israelite religion until the completion of Solomon's temple. However, although excavation of Phoenician temples reveals a floor plan very similar to that of the first temple, it has been harder to find close parallels to the plan and proportion of the tabernacle. Astonishingly, Joshua Berman marshals evidence that the tabernacle is modeled on the camp of Pharaoh Ramesses II as depicted in the Kadesh bas-reliefs. Berman notes, the resemblance of the military camp at Kadesh to the tabernacle goes beyond architecture, it is conceptual as well. For Egyptians, Ramesses was both a military leader and a divinity. In the Torah, God is likewise a divinity, obviously, but also Israel's leader in battle. The tent of God, the divine warrior, parallels the tent of the Pharaoh, the living Egyptian god, poised for battle. Thank you.